So a couple of weeks ago, I got a really good question from my Q and Play series that essentially asked, "Hey Crispy, what content do you cut from your D&D campaigns, and why did it have to go?" I thought this was really cool. I told him what content I cut from my games, and then I moved on. I didn't really think about why I cut that content, and then I realized that the why is actually very, very interesting. As Dungeon Masters, we prepare a lot for our D&D games, and inevitably, we're going to get ideas that don't fully pan out and that don't make it into our games. How do we know what content needs to go, and how do we know what content needs to stay? These are really important questions, and I want to answer them today on Tabletop Tavern Tips. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk about how I prep my games, because that's going to be the framework for how I decide to cut content and the way I'm going to give the advice further on this video. Keep in mind, this is just the way I prep my D&D games, though I do think there are still some things that you can learn even if you prep your games in a different manner. So, in my own D&D games, I theme my sessions around a central goal, and then the rest of the session revolves around what happens with that central goal. It could be a major encounter that happens during the session, a major roleplay event, usually those two things, and that's about it. Those are the two things that a lot of my sessions revolve around. Like, for example, if the characters are going to raid the hideout of a bandit camp, for example, then the session is probably going to revolve around this major event. That bandit camp is probably going to be a dungeon with a boss at the end. There's going to be like a quest that starts it up. The party are going to travel there, etc., etc., etc. The whole session revolves around that moment. Other things are going to happen that involve other story threads, obviously, but for the majority of the game, the focus is on that bandit camp, that bandit hideout, and that whole dungeon shenanigans. Just recently, I had a session revolving around a roleplay event, more specifically, a villain, possible ally reveal. It turns out, in my party's pirate crew, one of their longtime allies was actually hiding a devious secret. She was secretly the clairvoyant, a spy master that I established all the way in session 1. We're on like session 35 now to put into perspective how long this long con was, and they were pretty shocked at her reveal, and the theme and the central focus of the session was appropriately revealing the clairvoyant, talking about who this person is. It all revolved around that roleplay event. Even if the roleplay event itself didn't take up the majority of the session like a dungeon would, it only was like 20-30 minute long encounter, the rest of the session was all sort of with that roleplay event in the backdrop. They were always thinking about the clairvoyant, and everything that they did was predicated on the information the clairvoyant gave. The clairvoyant reveal, all the exposition and the monologuing that came from it, that was the central focus of the session. So, when I'm deciding whether or not to keep content, I ask myself, is this content pertinent to the central idea, the central goal of the session? Now, of course, like I said earlier, extra story threads are going to be part of your session. That is natural. But I try to minimize that as much as possible. Sure, during the clairvoyant reveal, for example, I briefly mentioned the Masked Council, very similar to Waterdeep, basically the government that controls the country the party are currently adventuring in. I could give a full exposition and monologue about what the Masked Council is, but it's not that pertinent. They're the government. The party understand what a government is. They understand everything they need to know. Moving on, we can talk about this another time. The central focus is the clairvoyant. Talking about the Masked Council would just distract from that central focus. I only have so much time in this session. And remember, this is Dungeons and Dragons, not a book. In D&D, yeah, you're playing a 4-hour game or a 2-hour game or what have you. It's so long, right? Yeah, but your players are going to take up a lot of that time themselves. Remember, players have their own stuff they want to do. They have their own choices, and that means that you could plan like, oh yeah, I have 4 hours. That's plenty of time to give all this information. That time is going to vanish really quickly once you actually put players into the mix and they start making decisions and doing their own thing, which, by the way, is okay. That's part of the allure of Dungeons and Dragons, that players get to do their thing. But that means that your information needs to be delivered with a little bit of expediency. And I don't mean like literal expediency. If anything, you should probably talk slow when you're delivering your information. But yeah, when it comes to information that I'm going to keep, it's information that is themed and in line with the central focus of the session itself. If it's not in line with central focus, it gets cut. Story beats that don't fit need to go, because players are going to create their own story beats themselves, and that means I'm going to run out of time for the important stuff, and it's going to make my storytelling a big pain later on. Now, I also understand that a lot of content that we as Dungeon Masters cut isn't necessarily of the storytelling variety. What about encounters? Well, last session, I also cut a major encounter from the game. Why did I do this? Well, it was simple. I knew that the encounter wouldn't be fun for my players. Look, when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, it's really hard to predict how much fun your players are going to have during your D&D encounters, during your dungeons and whatnot. It's really difficult to predict that sort of thing. Sometimes you will pick out a bunch of monsters, you'll put them down and think, wow, this is going to be really interesting. And then your players get there, and it's a boring slog. Now, I don't think you should do this every time, but sometimes the best thing you can do to sort of shorten that slog down a little bit is just to cut things out. The situation where I cut a major encounter was this. The party are going through a dungeon. There are 3 encounters. One encounter with kobolds, another encounter with a minotaur, and another encounter at the end. It's a big plot twist. There's actually a mind flare at the end. Ooh, spooky. Okay, so the first encounter against the kobolds and some beasts goes really long. This encounter is taking a while. The players are doing well, but they've got some unfortunate rolls, and I gave the kobolds a bit too much health, maybe overtuned them by a few hit points, and that meant that the encounter took a little bit longer than I would have liked. And now they've got to face the Minotaur and then the Mind Flare. I decided to cut the Minotaur for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Minotaur is essentially just a trash mob. I meant it to be just a big old gatekeeper standing in front of the Mind Flayer's lair. But the Mind Flayer is also the far more interesting enemy. I homebrewed it a little bit, gave it some really interesting abilities. It's way more cool as a fight. The Minotaur is a hit point shield just standing in front of a more interesting encounter. So, retroactively, while they were still fighting the kobolds, I went to my map and cut the Minotaur out. Just cut them out of the game and let them skip straight to the Mind Flayer. And I do not regret doing this at all. The Mind Flayer fight was way more intense and actually resulted in the party losing and getting teleported, plane shifted into another dimension. Really cool plot twist for the next session. And if I put the Minotaur fight in there, it wouldn't have been interesting at all. They would have beaten the Minotaur, but it would have taken a few rounds, it would have eaten into the time in the session, and it would have delayed from reaching the more interesting climax of the dungeon. That is how I decide when to cut encounters, when to cut out combat that I generally worked on. Yeah, I know what's probably going to happen. They're going to beat the Minotaur, but it's probably not going to be fun to do that. It's not worth the risk. I am almost certain that they would enjoy that Mind Flayer fight, and I was right. They enjoyed the Mind Flayer fight far more than I think they would have enjoyed fighting that stupid meat shield Minotaur. So yeah, that's how I decide to cut stuff out of combat. Try to ensure that you're keeping the energy up. If you think a fight's just gonna be a meat shield, then maybe it needs to go, especially if you're starting to run out of time in the session to get to the good stuff. Okay, finally, let's talk about world elements, stuff like cities and NPCs. Mostly NPCs. We'll address cities first real quick. I'm gonna be honest, guys, I develop my cities when my party decide to visit them. If I've got some time on my hands, I'll develop them early, but the city that they're currently in, I'll admit it, I developed it right as the party decided to go there. Because developing a city takes a while. I'm not going to do it ahead of time if the party aren't going to visit. I do not like wasted time. You're going to learn that about me if you watch a lot of these Tabletop Tavern tips videos. I don't like wasting time in my D&D prep, so I end up just prepping when the party decide to go there. I ask them where they want to go at the end of the session, and it gives me a week to figure out what I want to do with that location. It is as simple as that. That means if I cut a city, I'm basically just cutting a general concept and a name. When I'm developing a city, I just start with that. General concept for what the city is, a name, and maybe some art that I found on ArtStation, and that's it. So if they end up not going to a city, it's not a really big deal. Alright, so what about NPCs? Well, for NPCs, I usually end up deprioritizing them, not cutting them entirely. I like making my world feel alive with a bunch of different characters, meaning I introduce characters once every 3 sessions or so. And sometimes characters are just there to add a little bit of flavor. I mean, think about how many NPCs are in your D&D campaign. There are so many. Some of them are going to get priority, some of them are going to take a back seat. When I cut an NPC, it's simply taking a back seat. They still exist in the world. They haven't been cut out entirely. They're still there, they just aren't going to take as much of a presence in the campaign as NPCs that my party show interest in. And that's how I decide whether or not I'm going to cut something. It is simply party interest. If the party are showing a lot of interest in an NPC, they get prioritized. They get to stay in the campaign and take a bigger spotlight. But if an NPC is sort of falling at the wayside in terms of player interest, I deprioritize them. I move them aside for characters that the party clearly like more. Now, of course, there are times where an NPC that I really like is not liked by the players, and that is only natural. It's going to happen. And I rectify that by simply having, again, the character take a backseat. They're not getting axed entirely. They're still going to be in the campaign, but I try to prioritize my players' enjoyment here. I enjoy playing all my NPCs. That's why I made them. So yeah, if an NPC that I particularly like is not liked by the players, it's not a big deal to me. I like all of my NPCs, and if my players like them too, it's just an extra cherry on top. That's how I decide what to prioritize when it comes to creating characters. Now, before I end this video, I do want to say that when you deprioritize content in your D&D game, or axe it or cut it or whatever you want to say, when you do that, that doesn't mean that the content is gone forever. When you decide not to use that encounter, you can always save it for later. Rest assured, that Minotaur may return someday. That city that I never used in this campaign, well, next campaign, maybe it'll make an appearance. These ideas don't need to vanish forever. They just need to be put in the vault and saved for a later time. That's the big thing for me. Content is never really cut in D&D. It's just not used for now. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our RPG Horror Story series, where we cover the best of the worst of Dungeons and Dragons. And while you're there in the cards, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comments the axe to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.